Today, we are digging into Liaquat Ahmed's incredible book, Lords of Finance, to get to the bottom of one of the greatest catastrophes of the modern age. It's really a story about how the decisions, the biases, and the flaws of just four men helped throw the entire world into the Great Depression.
And honestly, that quote from Disraeli is the perfect way to look at this story. This isn't some dry, dusty explainer on economic theory. No, this is a deeply human story. It's about ambition, it's about prejudice, and it's about fatal flaws. It's a powerful reminder that at the heart of these massive global events are just people. So picture this. It's the decade right after the First World War, and the world's entire financial system is basically in the hands of these four guys. They're the heads of the central banks of Great Britain, the United States, Germany, and France. And their choices, which were shaped as much by their personalities as by any economic data, would end up leading the world straight down a path to ruin.
All right, so who exactly were these men? Let's get to know the four powerful and, as you're about to see, deeply flawed protagonists of our story.
First up, we have Montague Norman of the Bank of England. And let me tell you, he was anything but your typical banker. He was this tall, eccentric figure with a pointed white beard, looked more like a character out of an old painting. He lived in a house that was described as a millionaire's monastery. He dabbled in spiritualism and even claimed he could walk through walls. But, and this is crucial, he also suffered from crippling manic depression, which had a huge impact on his judgment. Now, the real leader of this group, the de facto conductor of the whole orchestra, was Benjamin Strong, the head of the New York Fed. He was tall, confident, incredibly charismatic. A friend of his said that wherever Strong sat, that was the head of the table. But behind that powerful exterior, Strong was secretly fighting a losing battle with tuberculosis. It was an illness that would tragically take him off the world stage at the absolute worst possible moment. Then you've got Germany's Hilmar Schacht. Talk about a character. He was ambitious, arrogant, known for his really cutting sense of humor. Schacht wasn't just a banker. He was a master of chaos. His job was to tame Germany's insane hyperinflation, and that path would lead him to some, well, let's just say some very fateful decisions. You know, Schacht's ambition had absolutely no limits. When somebody asked him who would run Germany's finances if Hitler came to power, his response was chilling. He just said, "I will. The Nazis cannot rule, but I can and will rule through them." This was a man who saw chaos as a ladder, and he was ready to climb it. And rounding out our group is Émile Moreau of the Banque de France. Moreau was a fierce nationalist. His number one priority, always, was protecting French interests. He was deeply suspicious of international cooperation. And this focus on France's financial power above all else, as you can imagine, often put him directly at odds with the other three. So you have these four totally different personalities, right? The mystic, the conductor, the wizard, and the nationalist. And yet, they were all united by this one single powerful and, in the end, totally destructive obsession: their unwavering faith in the gold standard. Now, before the war, the gold standard was seen as the bedrock of the global economy. It seemed to promise stability. Every single dollar, pound, or franc was backed by a real, fixed amount of gold. So for these bankers, it stood for discipline, for order. Trying to restore it wasn't just some economic policy for them. It was like a moral crusade to turn back the clock to a world that made more sense. And this just perfectly illustrates the human drama behind the policy. In Britain, you had this huge debate. On one side, you have the ascetic Montague Norman, who lived this simple, almost monkish life. And on the other, his polar opposite, the new Chancellor of the Exchequer, Winston Churchill. A guy who loved his silk underwear, his champagne, his cigars. Churchill had serious doubts about going back to gold, but in the end, he was convinced by the so-called experts. And the impact on real people? It was immediate and it was brutal. To get back to that old pre-war gold value, Britain had to force prices down by 10%. You can see it right here on the chart. That UK price line just takes a nosedive while the US stays much steadier. This painful deflation absolutely crippled British industries. It made their goods too expensive to sell, and it led directly to mass unemployment and just bitter, widespread labor strikes. So this rigid obsession with gold created a financial system that was just fatally brittle. The best way to think about it is like a financial straitjacket. It forced countries to keep their interest rates high to protect their gold reserves, which basically choked off any real economic growth. All that extra money, all that hot money, had to go somewhere, so it poured into a gigantic speculative bubble on Wall Street. And when that bubble burst, The straitjacket of gold meant that nobody could do what was needed to stop the bleeding. The collapse happened with shocking speed. First, in 1928, the whole system lost its conductor when Benjamin Strong died. Just a year later, Wall Street crashed, sending a panic across the globe. And then, the dominoes just started to fall. A huge bank failure in the US, then another one in Austria. It triggered a chain reaction that no one seemed to be able to stop. And the human toll was just devastating. In Germany, which was already struggling under the weight of war reparations, the crisis was an absolute catastrophe. By 1931, a staggering 4.7 million people were out of work. That's nearly a quarter of the entire workforce. It created the perfect breeding ground for political extremism. So what happened to the men who oversaw this whole disaster? And more importantly, what was the big lesson learned from the wreckage of their policies?
Well, their fates were just as dramatic as their careers. Montagu Norman was a broken man. A friend said that when Britain left the gold standard, for Norman, it was as though a daughter should lose her virginity. As for Schacht, he was true to his word and used the chaos to rise to power under the Nazis. Moreau kind of faded into obscurity, chasing the lost cause of restoring a French king. And Strong, the conductor of it all, he died before he could see the terrible final act.
So, what's the big takeaway from all this? Well, the ultimate lesson could not be more clear. The countries that broke free from what people called the Golden Fetters, the earliest, were the first ones to recover. Britain did it in 1931 and started to get better. The US followed in 1933, and that marked the bottom of its depression. France clung to gold the longest, and it was the last major economy to finally emerge from the darkness.
Ultimately, the story of the Lords of Finance is just this incredibly powerful reminder of human fallibility. And it leaves us with a question that really echoes through to our own time. When we put the fate of the world into the hands of a powerful few, what happens when their ideas, their prejudices, and their very human flaws turn out to be wrong?